The arbitration court of the Allied Species Cooperation Framework occupied the judicial level of Convergence Station, the installation's designated space for the formal resolution of interspecies disputes, and the specific, neutral ground that the framework's legal architecture required for proceedings whose outcomes affected multiple civilizations' territorial and political arrangements. The court was designed for the function it served, the space carrying the proportions and the aesthetic qualities that judicial proceedings demanded. High ceilings, formal lighting, the specific atmospheric quality that institutional spaces produced when the institution's purpose was the resolution of conflicts whose scope exceeded the individuals present, and whose exceeding was communicated through the space's dimensions, which were larger than the number of people in the room required, because the largeness represented the scope of what the people's decisions affected. The proceedings were concluding. The territorial dispute between the Verath colonial authority and the Kalithi sovereignty's outer territorial command had been adjudicated. The arbitration panel's ruling delivered, the treaty's terms established, the military conflict's resolution formalized into the legal framework that the framework's judicial system used to translate battlefield outcomes into binding agreements. The ruling favored the Verath authority. The colonial holdings were confirmed. The annexation was nullified. The Outer Territorial Command's military operation was classified as unlawful territorial aggression, and the classification's legal consequence was the obligation to compensate the prevailing party for the costs of defending against the aggression. The compensation phase was the final step, the procedural mechanism through which the defeated party discharged the financial obligation that the ruling imposed, the payment that settled the account, closed the case, and concluded the institutional process that the conflict's resolution required. Ren Calloway stood in the court's respondent section, the position that the proceedings protocol designated for the prevailing party's military representative, the person whose contracted defense of the colonial holdings had produced the battlefield outcome that the arbitration was formalizing. He was 35. He occupied the respondent section with the specific quality of a man who had been standing in institutional spaces for too many hours, and whose too many hours were visible in the posture that the hours had produced, not the military bearing that formal settings typically extracted from career military personnel, but the settled, tired, functional posture of a man whose career had included enough institutional proceedings to have lost the formality that the preceding settings were designed to inspire. He was 6'1", built with the specific frame that 12 years of independent military contracting produced, lean, hard, the body of a man whose professional life was physical, and whose physical life was sustained rather than comfortable, the frame carrying the evidence of sustained operational stress in the way that sustained operational stress wrote itself into bodies, the leanness that insufficient rest and irregular nutrition produced, the hardness that combat maintained, the specific quality of physical competence that existed alongside physical depletion, the body capable and tired simultaneously. His face was the face that 12 years of contracted military work produced, angular, weathered, carrying the specific lines that operational environments carved into the tissue that covered the bones that the environments operated on. The weathering was comprehensive rather than dramatic, not the face of one terrible experience, but the face of many difficult ones accumulated over a career that provided them consistently. His eyes were gray, steady, carrying the controlled quality that combat experience developed in the visual systems of people whose combat experience was extensive enough to have trained the flinching out of the looking because flinching was a response that combat selected against. His hair was dark, kept short in the practical style that field operations required, and that he maintained between operations through the specific mechanism of not changing the style, because changing required caring and caring required energy that the caring's alternative uses consumed. He was tired. The tiredness was not the dramatic exhaustion that acute crisis produced. It was the sustained, settled, baseline tiredness of a man who had spent 4 months conducting tactical operations in a territorial defense campaign, and whose campaign's conclusion had produced not rest, but the administrative proceedings that conclusion required. The proceedings adding their duration to the tiredness that the campaign had established, and the addition producing the specific quality of a person who wanted the current event to end so that the wanting's object rest could be pursued. The outer territorial command's representatives occupied the opposing section. 3 Calithi officials, the defeated party's legal delegation, carrying the composed, formal bearing that Calithi institutional protocol produced in personnel performing official functions. The bearing maintained despite the defeat that the function was processing, because the bearing's maintenance was the institutional discipline that the processing required. The chief representative rose. The rising initiated the compensation presentation, the formal delivery of the defeated party's compensation package to the prevailing party, the delivery conducted through the institutional protocol that the arbitration court's procedures specified. The outer territorial command, the representative said, and the formal harmonic register carried the specific, measured cadence that Calithi official address used for proceedings of legal significance, presents the following compensation in accordance with the arbitration's ruling and in satisfaction of the obligation that the ruling imposes. Callaway expected credits. He expected resource allocations. He expected the standard financial package that defeated parties presented in territorial disputes, the calculated sum that the arbitration's financial assessment specified, transferred through the institutional mechanisms that financial compensation used, received through the institutional mechanisms that financial compensation was received through, the entire process bureaucratic and impersonal and concluding. The court's rear doors opened. The opening admitted not a financial transfer but a person. She was escorted by 4 outer territorial command soldiers, the military escort that the tradition prescribed for the formal transfer of retribution personnel, the 4 soldiers flanking the person being transferred with the specific, ceremonial positioning that the tradition's protocol specified. The escort was formal. The escort was also functional, the soldiers' positioning communicating not merely ceremony, but the practical reality that the person being escorted required the restraint that the escort provided because the person being escorted was someone whose unrestrained presence constituted a physical threat that the escort's restraint was managing. She was bound. The ceremonial restraints were the Velsaron Kelthini's tradition's prescribed restraints, energy field constraints at wrists and ankles, the constraints' visible luminescence communicating their activation, and the activation communicating the restrained person's status as retribution transfer, the constraints serving the dual function of physical restraint and status communication. The constraints were the tradition's mechanism for performing the transfer's public dimension, the visible, unmistakable identification of the person being transferred as property being exchanged, the identification's public nature being the tradition's requirement, because the tradition treated the exchange as a public event, whose publicness validated the exchange's legitimacy. Valith Sorcaris moved through the ceremonial restraints with the specific, rigid, furious control of a body whose training had produced the capacity for explosive physical response, and whose capacity was being contained by the restraint's energy fields, and whose containment was producing in the contained body, the tension that containment produced when the contained thing was powerful, and the power's suppression was involuntary, and the involuntary's imposition was the humiliation that the tension was responding to. She was tall, 5'10", the height carrying the specific physical presence that Calithi female warriors developed when the development was driven by 12 years of combat-focused physical training, and when the training had produced a frame that was simultaneously powerful and refined. The Calithi genetic architecture providing the elegance, and the training providing the capacity, the two producing a physiology that was striking in the specific way that the combination of beauty and lethality was striking when both were present at high levels, and the presence of both was visible in the same body. Her features were, the word the story's title used was accurate, gorgeous. The term was not the subjective assessment that aesthetic evaluation typically constituted. It was the specific, cross-cultural recognition that some configurations of features produced in observers regardless of the observer's species, because the configurations activated the aesthetic processing that multiple species' visual systems shared. Her face was the angular precision of Calithi facial architecture at its most refined. High cheekbones, defined jaw, features carrying the sharp, elegant geometry that selective genetics produced across generations, and that the generations had refined into a facial configuration that was arresting. The features commanding attention through the specific mechanism of being beautiful enough that the attention's redirection was involuntary. Her skin was deep twilight blue, the Calithi pigmentation at its most vivid, carrying the luminous depth that health and genetics combined to produce when both were operating at maximum expression. Her eyes were violet, bright, intense, carrying the enhanced Calithi visual perception with a quality that exceeded the standard. The eyes possessing the specific, dangerous quality that combat experience gave to eyes when the experience was extensive, and the extensive had trained the eyes into instruments of assessment rather than mere organs of perception. Her hair was dark copper, the standard Calithi coloring, maintained in the severe, practical arrangement that military personnel used, and that the severity's contrast with her features' beauty produced the specific visual tension that severity and beauty produced when both were present, and the severity was chosen, and the choosing communicated that the beauty was irrelevant to the person possessing it, and that the irrelevance was the point. Her body was the body that 12 years of warrior-class training produced, powerful, precise, carrying the specific combination of strength and fluidity that Calithi combat physiology developed when the development was sustained and intensive. The power was visible through the ceremonial restraints, the muscle tension that the fury and the containment produced, making the body's capability evident even in its constrained state. The body communicating through its restrained tension, the specific, credible promise that the body's unrestrained state would produce consequences for whoever the unrestrained state was directed at. Her bioluminescent patterns were in a state that required no chromatic literacy to interpret the bright, sharp, burning crimson that the Calithi emotional vocabulary classified as Velkorith. Rage. Pure, focused, contained rage. The rage of a warrior whose culture had transferred her as property, whose status as a decorated combat veteran had been converted into compensation currency, whose 12 years of service and 300 confirmed engagements and the Kelvas distinction had been assessed by her own command as equivalent to a financial payment, and the equivalence's assessment was the insult that the rage was responding to, and the response was contained by the ceremonial restraints, and the containment was making the rage brighter, because the containment was additional humiliation layered on the primary humiliation. She was presented. The presentation was formal, the chief representative introducing the retribution payment with the specific institutional language that the tradition prescribed. The outer territorial command presents Valith Sorcaris, war champion, holder of the Kelvas distinction, as retribution payment under the Velsaron Kelthenes, the retribution of honored exchange. Her martial value exceeds the arbitration's calculated financial obligation. Her transfer satisfies the compensation requirement and constitutes an expression of respect for the victor's achievement. The court was silent. The silence was the specific, comprehensive silence that occupied rooms when the room's occupants were processing something that their frameworks were insufficient to accommodate simultaneously. Calloway looked at the woman. The woman looked at Calloway. The looking was mutual, but the looking's content was asymmetric, his looking carrying the specific, visible, processing expression of a man who was encountering something his framework did not contain, and whose framework's absence was producing the cognitive arrest that the absence generated. Her looking carrying the specific, burning, focused assessment of a warrior, evaluating the person who had just been presented with ownership of her, and whose evaluation was the combat assessment that warriors performed when they were assessing threats, and whose assessment's conclusion was visible in the way the assessment was being performed. She was measuring him, calculating how she would kill him, the calculation ongoing and the ongoing visible in the bright, violent precision of her regard. No, Calloway said. The word was immediate. The word was the instinctive, unconsidered, reflexive response of a man whose moral framework had encountered something that the framework classified as wrong, and whose classification produced the refusal before the refusal's consequences had been calculated. The moral response preceding the strategic assessment, because the moral response operated at a speed that the strategic assessment could not match. I'm not, no, this is a person, you can't, I don't accept this. She's not payment, she's not property, release her. The outer territorial command's chief representative processed the refusal with the specific, visible recalibration that unexpected responses produced in institutional personnel, whose institutional training had not included the preparation for the response being received. The recalibration produced a response that was institutional rather than personal, the representative's training engaging the diplomatic protocol that the tradition's legal framework specified for refusal scenarios. The refusal of retribution payment under the Velsoran Kelthenes constitutes an insult to the honor of the defeated party. The insult's legal consequence, under the tradition's arbitration provisions, is the nullification of the peace treaty's compensation clause. The nullification renders the treaty incomplete. An incomplete treaty has no binding force. The territorial dispute resumes. The words entered the court with the weight that words carried when the words described consequences that exceeded the words' content. The weight of thousands of lives, of the 4 months of combat that the treaty was supposed to end, of the military operations that the treaty's nullification would restart. You're telling me, Calloway said, and his voice carried the specific, controlled quality that a voice carried when the voice's owner was managing the fury that the situation was producing and managing it because the fury's expression would not serve the situation's resolution. That if I refuse to accept a human being as property, you restart the war. The tradition's legal framework does not recognize the refusal as a moral objection. The framework recognizes the refusal as an assessment of the retribution's insufficiency, an insult to the warrior's value, and by extension, to the outer territorial command's honor. The insult's consequence is treaty nullification. The consequence is not discretionary. And if I accept, the transfer is complete, the treaty is concluded, the peace holds. Calloway stood in the arbitration court and performed the specific, devastating calculation that the situation demanded, the arithmetic of competing moral imperatives, the math that arose when do not own people and do not restart wars occupied the same equation, and the equation permitted only one solution, and the solution required violating one imperative to preserve the other. Thousands of lives, colonial civilians, military personnel on both sides, the 4 months of combat that had already produced casualties whose number the arbitration's records documented and whose documentation was present in Calloway's memory, because the casualties included people he had served alongside and whose serving alongside made the casualties personal rather than statistical. Valith stood in the ceremonial restraints and watched the calculation happen. The watching was the combat assessment's continuation, the warrior observing the person whose decision would determine her immediate future, and whose observation was producing the specific, contemptuous evaluation that the observation's context generated. The human was hesitating. The human was uncomfortable. The human was performing the weak, pathetic calculation that weakness performed when weakness encountered a situation that required strength and the strength was absent, and the absence produced the visible, shameful display of a person who could not decide what to do. Calloway looked at the arbitration panel. The panel's expression confirmed the representative's legal assessment. The tradition's framework was binding within the arbitration scope, and the refusal's consequence was the nullification that the representative described. He looked at Valeth. She stared back with the bright crimson of Velcorith, the rage undimmed, the assessment continuing, the calculation of his death's methodology refining itself in real time behind the violet eyes that were beautiful and lethal. Acceptance had cost the person performing it something. That the acceptance was not the easy claim of a victor receiving a prize, but the agonized compliance of a person doing something they found repugnant, because the alternative was more repugnant, and the comparative's logic was the only logic available. The observation registered. The observation did not change her assessment. The observation was filed alongside the assessment's other data points. The human was weak. The human was uncomfortable with ownership. The human's discomfort was irrelevant to the ownership's reality, and the ownership's reality was the framework within which she would plan her response, and the response would be his death at the earliest opportunity that the ceremonial restraints removal provided. The arbitration court concluded its proceedings. The treaty was signed. The peace held. The territorial dispute was formally resolved. The compensation financial for the Verath Authority personnel for Calloway was transferred. Calloway was led to the post-proceedings administrative section, the institutional space where the transfer's documentation was completed and where the transferred person's custody arrangements were formalized. Valeth was escorted alongside him, the four-soldier escort maintaining its ceremonial position, the restraints maintaining their containment, the contained person maintaining the rigid, furious, lethal composure that the containment and the fury and the lethality combined to produce. The administrative section was bureaucratic, the institutional environment that paperwork required, the space carrying the specific quality of a place where significant things were reduced to documentation, and the documentation's completion was the mechanism through which the significant things became official. Calloway was given custody documentation. The documentation identified Valeth Sorcaris as his legal property under the Calithi Retribution tradition's framework, the identification performing the specific, institutional act of recording, one person's ownership of another in the language that institutional recording used for the recording. He signed the documentation. The signing was performed with the same visible, physical difficulty that the verbal acceptance had carried, the pen moving with the specific, reluctant motion of a hand, performing an action that the hand's owner found morally repugnant, and that the repugnance was being overridden by the calculation that the repugnance's alternative produced. He then asked for additional documentation. The asking was directed at the administrative section's human legal liaison, the framework's representative whose role included the facilitation of legal processes that the framework's human rights-derived provisions supported. "I need to file for legal emancipation," Calloway said, "under the framework's individual rights provisions. Article 7, Section 3. The supersession of allied cultural practices by framework human rights standards in cases where the cultural practices produce outcomes incompatible with individual liberty." The legal liaison processed the request. The processing was the institutional response to a request that the institution's procedures supported, but that the request's timing, immediately following the acceptance of retribution transfer, made unusual enough that the processing required the institutional equivalent of a double take. "You're filing for the emancipation of the person you just accepted as retribution transfer." "I'm filing for the emancipation of a person." The acceptance was performed to prevent treaty nullification. The emancipation is being filed to undo the acceptance's ownership implication through the legal mechanism that the framework provides for exactly this kind of situation. The filing will take time. The process requires review, diplomatic consultation, and legal assessment. The outer territorial command will likely challenge the filing on cultural sovereignty grounds. The filing's timeline is the filing's timeline. The filing's initiation is now. The filing's initiation is now, the liaison confirmed. And the confirmation was the institutional mechanism engaging, the bureaucratic process beginning, the legal machinery that would produce Valeth's freedom activating through the specific, procedurally irritating, institutionally necessary mechanism of a legal petition working its way through the framework's judicial architecture. The escort was dismissed. The ceremonial restraints were deactivated. The Retribution tradition's protocols specifying that the restraints were removed upon the transfer's completion and the custody's formalization, the tradition assuming that the person accepting custody had sufficient means to manage the transferred person, and that the management was the accepting person's responsibility. The restraints deactivation was the moment Valeth had been calculating toward. The energy fields dissipated. The wrists and ankles that the fields had constrained were free. The body that the constraints had contained was uncontained. She moved. The movement was fast, the specific trained. Explosive movement that 12 years of warrior-class combat training produced when the training was expressed through a body whose fury had been contained for 2 hours, and whose containment's end released the fury's physical expression, with the accumulated force that containment produced when the contained thing was powerful, and the containment had compressed the power into the density that compression created. Calloway responded. The response was not the response of a man who was unprepared. It was the response of a man who had been calculating the same timeline she had, who had known that the restraints removal would produce exactly this response, and whose knowledge had informed his positioning and his readiness. He blocked the strike. The blocking was the trained, efficient response of a man whose 12 years of independent military contracting had included enough personal combat to produce the reflexive defensive capability that the blocking required. The block was effective. The block was also painful, her strike carrying the force that her training and her fury produced, and the force exceeding the comfort zone of what blocks were comfortable to perform. She struck again. He blocked again. The exchange was fast, intense, occupying the narrow administrative corridor that the post-proceeding section consisted of, and that the corridor's dimensions were not designed for combat, and that the combat's occurrence within the dimensions was producing the specific, chaotic quality that fighting in spaces not designed for fighting produced. "Stop," he said, and his voice carried the specific, controlled quality of a man who was managing a physical confrontation and a verbal communication simultaneously, and whose simultaneous management was producing the compressed, functional vocal quality that simultaneous management demanded. "Stop, I need to explain something." She did not stop. The not stopping was the warrior's response to command from the person whose ownership she rejected. The refusal to comply constituting the first assertion of the autonomy that the restraints removal permitted, and that the assertion was being expressed through the medium of continued violence, because violence was the language that her training had made her most fluent in, and the fluency was the tool she deployed when the deploying was the thing the situation demanded. He caught the third strike. The catching was not a block. It was the specific, deliberate interception that redirected the strike's force rather than absorbing it, the technique of a man whose combat training included the management of opponents whose physical capability exceeded his own, and whose management required redirection rather than opposition. The catching held her wrist, not the restraint's energy field but his hand, the physical contact communicating something that the energy field had not. The specific, human quality of a person who was holding rather than constraining, the hold firm enough to prevent the strike's completion without the punitive force that a captor's hold would have carried. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice was close. The proximity that the catching had produced, their positions face to face, the 20-inch differential between his 6'1" and her 5'10" creating a proximity that was intimate in its closeness and adversarial in its context. "You are not my property. You were never going to be my property. I accepted the transfer because refusing it would have nullified the peace treaty and restarted a war that already killed hundreds of people. I have filed." He adjusted his grip on her wrist as she tested the hold. "I have filed for your legal emancipation under the framework's human rights provisions. The filing was submitted 30 minutes ago. The process will take time because the process is bureaucratic and bureaucratic processes take time. But the process's conclusion will be your legal freedom recognized by every jurisdiction in the framework's scope." She was still. The stillness was not submission. It was the specific, alert, analytical stillness of a warrior whose assessment was being recalibrated by information that the assessment's previous framework did not contain. Her violet eyes were fixed on his gray ones across the proximity that the caught wrist produced, the looking carrying the assessment that the looking always carried, and the assessment encountering data that the assessment's model did not predict, and the encountering producing the analytical pause that unpredicted data required. "You filed for my emancipation 30 minutes ago, while you were still in restraints. The filing was the first thing I did after signing the custody documentation, because the custody documentation was the thing I needed to sign to have standing to file for the emancipation, and the emancipation was the point of signing the documentation. You accepted ownership to file for its dissolution. I accepted a legal status that I consider barbaric to prevent a war from restarting, and I immediately initiated the legal process to dissolve the status, because the status's existence is wrong, and the wrong is going to be corrected through the mechanism available for correcting it. You consider the tradition barbaric. I consider the tradition of giving people to other people as payment for military outcomes barbaric. Yes, the word is accurate." Her bioluminescent pattern shifted. The bright crimson of Velkorith, the burning rage that had been continuous since the court, did not disappear. The rage was still present, still bright, still the dominant chromatic expression. But beneath the crimson at the edges, a secondary color was emerging. The pale, desaturated luminescence that the Calithi chromatic vocabulary classified as Velnatharis. The expression of encountering something the mind's framework could not accommodate. Framework failure. The gorgeous, lethal warrior, whose plan for the post-restraint period had been the straightforward, satisfying plan of killing the person who owned her, was experiencing the specific, cognitive disruption of discovering that the person who owned her was working to unown her, that the ownership was a legal fiction maintained for the specific purpose of being dissolved, that the person she had assessed as weak was not weak, but operating within a moral framework that her assessment had not accounted for, and that the framework's operation was producing behavior that her framework could not predict, because her framework did not contain the category of person who accepts ownership of another person for the purpose of immediately destroying the ownership. "I am still going to kill you," she said, and the statement was delivered with the flat, factual precision that statements carried when the statements were assessments rather than threats, and when the assessment's content was the assessor's genuine expectation of future events. "I appreciate the honesty. The emancipation process takes approximately 6 to 8 weeks. I would prefer to survive the 6 to 8 weeks so that the process can conclude, and you can be legally free to decide whether killing me is still your preferred course of action." "You are asking me to not kill you. I am asking you to wait 6 to 8 weeks before deciding whether to kill me. The waiting allows the legal process to complete. The completion produces your freedom. The freedom allows you to make the decision to kill me or not kill me as a free person, rather than as someone whose legal status is in bureaucratic transit." She stared at him. The staring was the assessment's continuation. The warrior's analytical processing, working through the information that the processing's previous model had not contained. the model updating in real time as the data's implications were integrated. The data's implications were destabilizing. The data said the person holding her wrist was not the captor she had expected, not the owner she had prepared for, not the human whose weakness she had diagnosed as the specific, contemptible weakness that squeamishness constituted. The data said the person holding her wrist was someone who found the entire situation as repugnant as she did, who was solving the problem the situation presented through the mechanism his culture provided, and who was holding her wrist not because the holding constituted ownership, but because the holding was preventing her from killing the person who was trying to free her. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. 6 to 8 weeks. And during the 6 to 8 weeks, you are legally in my custody, because the custody is the legal status that the emancipation petition is in the process of dissolving. The custody is paperwork. The paperwork describes a legal arrangement. The legal arrangement does not describe a reality that I am interested in enforcing. You are not my prisoner. You are not my property. You are a person whose legal status is temporarily complicated by a tradition I find barbaric and a diplomatic situation I am navigating as carefully as I can while being threatened with death by someone who has killed more people in personal combat than I have killed in my entire career. 317. I'm sorry. 317. My confirmed engagement count. Your career record documents 84. I have killed approximately 4 times the number of people you have killed. The information is relevant to the threat assessment. The information is received and noted. The information does not change the emancipation filing's timeline or my commitment to its completion. She looked at him. The assessment was ongoing, but the assessment's character was changing. The data's integration producing a model that the previous model had not contained, and that the new model's presence was producing the specific, uncomfortable, unfamiliar experience of a warrior encountering someone whose response to her threat was not fear, not aggression, not the performance of dominance that ownership produced, but the tired, honest, determined response of a man who was doing a thing he found morally necessary, and who was willing to be threatened with death while doing it because the doing was more important than the threat. 6 to 8 weeks, she said again. The repetition was not agreement. The repetition was the verbalization of a timeline that the warrior was accepting not as a concession, but as a tactical parameter. The duration within which the assessment would continue, and within which the assessment's conclusion would determine whether the man holding her wrist had told the truth, and whether the truth's content was the content that the truth's delivery had described. 6 to 8 weeks, he confirmed. I will be watching you. I would expect nothing less. He released her wrist. The releasing was deliberate, the hand opening, the contact ending, the physical hold that had maintained the conversation's proximity dissolving, and the dissolving communicating through its deliberateness, the thing that the deliberateness was designed to communicate. The holding had been temporary. The holding was over. The holding's purpose had been communication rather than control, and the communication's completion meant the holding's function was served, and the function's completion meant the holding was no longer necessary. She stood in the administrative corridor, unrestrained, unbound, in the custody of a man who had just released her wrist, and whose releasing was the most confusing thing that had happened to her in a day that had included being presented as currency, and having her ceremonial restraints removed and attempting to kill someone, and being caught mid-attempt, and being told that the person she attempted to kill was in the process of legally freeing her. The corridor held them, the institutional space providing the mundane, bureaucratic environment that the situation's institutional dimension required, the space's banality contrasting with the situation's intensity in the specific way that institutional spaces contrasted with the human events that occurred within them. I need coffee, Calloway said. The arbitration court's proceedings lasted 4 hours, and the post-proceedings administrative work lasted another 2, and I have been awake for approximately 22 hours, and the coffee is the thing that the 22 hours require. You are discussing coffee. I am discussing the immediate logistical priority. The emancipation filing is submitted. The diplomatic situation is as managed as it can be at this point in the process. The immediate priority is coffee. The coffee's location is the station's commercial district. The walk to the commercial district is approximately 10 minutes. You are welcome to accompany me or to not accompany me. The accompaniment is not an order. The accompaniment is an option. Valith Sorcaris, war champion, holder of the Kelvas distinction, person whose confirmed engagement count was 317, person whose current legal status was in bureaucratic transit between property and freedom, stood in an institutional corridor and processed the option with the analytical tools that the option's absurdity required. The option was coffee. The person offering the option was the person whose ownership of her was a legal fiction maintained for the specific purpose of destroying itself. The person was tired. The person was walking toward the commercial district. The person had released her wrist and had not attempted to constrain her further, and was currently walking away from her without looking back, which was either the most confident or the most foolish thing a person could do when the person walking away had just been told by a woman who had killed 317 people